I'm Gene Kuleta, editor of the Latin America Advisor at the Inter-American Dialogue in Washington. The size and importance of the European Union have led to European regulations and standards being adopted in other countries, including in Latin America. This is a topic that Ana Heeren, a managing director and Latin America head at FTI Consulting, has been examining closely. She joins us today from Washington. Hello, Ana. Thank you so much for joining us today on this topic.
Thank you for having me, Jean. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Terrific. Now, as we get into discussing the Brussels effect, could you tell me a little bit about what the Brussels effect is and why do policies that are enacted by the EU go global to locations including Latin America?
Well, the Brussels effect is actually a term, Jean, that has been around for quite some time. It's been the subject of many scholars and research, academic research. But really, to put it simply, the way we like to think of the Brussels effect is the Europeanization of policies, how policies get transported from Europe into emerging markets like Latin America. So, and what I'll also say is, that process of Europeanization of policies and transporting one policy from one region to another actually comes at quite a high cost to businesses that are trying to operate in Latin America.
Interesting. Well, let's get into that. What kinds of costs do you think about in terms of that, and what kinds of costs do businesses see when these sorts of policies are exported to Latin America from Europe?
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting. I think there are a few factors here that come into play, and there are several reasons why it becomes costly to companies trying to operate in the region. And I'll put it into two buckets. The first one is really the speed with which we're seeing these policies being transported. Right, the EU has many landmark policies, and I think in today's world, it typically is taking between 2 to 3 years for a policy to be implemented in Europe and then to quickly make its way to Latin America, right? And if we think about that time frame and really the breadth and the scope of some of these policies, it really is quite a short time for a business to adapt. Right. The other element that I think also impacts businesses is just I would frame it into infrastructure and bureaucratic capabilities. Right. Latin America compared to the EU doesn't obviously have the same. The EU has a central policymaking body. They have regulators at the country level. Right. And I think we could say Latin America that is indeed quite the opposite. So it really is these two factors, right? The haste and then the bureaucratic capabilities that allow and basically have an impact on companies and change. Quick change in the business environment is costly, and so I would put it into those two things.
And could you tell me a little bit more about how we get to this point in terms of how policies get from Europe to Latin America and other parts of the world, and why is it that countries, including ones in Latin America and the Caribbean, decide to adopt EU policies?
Yeah, and look, I think maybe some analysts will say, well, there's a connection between Europe and Latin America. There's, a long history of colonization, certainly, that goes back many years. And there's been, in many ways, a history of, Latin America looking to Europe for answers, for, perhaps guidance on, how to institute certain elements and solve local problems. But I think that's simply put. I would say it's a lot more than that. There are a few elements that come into play that are quite important. And one of them is, Latin American people, their societies, our civil society, certainly, they're demanding a lot more from their governments. We no longer live in a world where we can be isolated. There's a digital element, right, and a global media environment that comes into play where, civil society populations are hearing about things that are being implemented in Europe, and they're thinking, well, wouldn't that be a good solution for some of the local problems I have in my country? And that's certainly also influencing governments. Their governments are looking and hearing about, these policies and saying, well, wouldn't that be a good fit, a good kind of blueprint for some of the problems that I face locally and that I need to find solutions for. So it's very intricate, but a lot of elements come into play.
It certainly sounds like it. Now, could you tell us a little bit about how this has played out in the past? And when we think about policies that have been exported from Europe to Latin America, what kinds of policies are we talking about? Which examples come to mind, and which industries are affected?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball, but I can tell you a little bit about some examples in the past, and certainly one that I think our listeners will remember and know about, and that is GDPR, which was enacted in 2018 and quickly replicated to Brazil, and we saw a replica of it touch Brazil's Congress and in many other countries like Colombia, Peru, Argentina followed suit. And I'll tell you, in a recent poll that I saw, only 16% of Brazilian companies had actually taken the steps to recently to implement GDPR in those companies. So it really goes to show that timing is an issue, right? Another good example that comes to mind is waste management policies of, I think it was 2015, that certainly were in many ways transported to Colombia and Chile and to other emerging markets like India. So definitely some of the sectors you can imagine, some highly regulated industries are being impacted by these large landmark policies.
All right, terrific. When you mentioned GDPR, I just wanted to get back to that for just a moment. Can you refresh our viewers' memory on what GDPR is? And as it was adopted in Brazil, could you tell me a little bit more about what Brazil's experience with it was, and how well that transition went from Europe to when it was adopted in Brazil?
Yeah, so GDPR is the data privacy regulation, and if I speak about the experience in Brazil, and certainly if this latest poll has anything to show, I think companies, global corporations even, have been struggling with how do you adapt, but not only how do you implement it. I think from the business sector side, companies want to comply, right? There is this desire, well, I'm operating in a country, I want to be compliant. It is a matter of how quickly can you also change your infrastructure to be compliant. And I think on the other side of the coin, how can the Brazilian government really be patrolling and really checking that companies are being compliant. So a lot of times there is this desire to move quickly, but without really taking into account the local context, right? The infrastructure that you have in place. So those are some of the things that I would remark that are, certainly in my position at FTI, we've seen some of our clients face.
Right. Now, when you think about the Brussels effect in general, as regards the experience in Latin America, on balance, is it a good thing or is it a bad thing?
Look, I definitely want to give a positive and end on a positive note. Certainly, I think one of the reasons that EU policies are becoming harmful in a way to Latin America is not because of the policies themselves, right? The policies are positive policies, and we should welcome this type of regulation. But it is really because because of the speed with which they're being enacted. One important party is kind of being left from the conversation and from the consultation period that would typically take place if we were talking about something that would take a little bit longer to be implemented. So, and that's the business sector, right? And I think much of that can be changed if both, and it certainly requires collaboration on both sides, right? Governments realizing that they need to consult with global and local businesses, because a lot of these players are global companies, and a lot of these global corporations realizing that when they are talking at the EU level, that they need to be talking early and often about with regulators at the European level, because we know for a fact that these landmark policies could and often do end up going global. And I'll give you a good example. I was talking to my colleagues in Brussels recently, right before COVID and before many of our plans changed, but with the European Green Deal, for example, which is another landmark policy in Europe that we've been hearing a lot about. There were plans in the EU to have diplomatic missions to Latin America precisely to talk about the European Green Deal. And so it's really not just civil society and Latin American communities and people that are pushing for their governments to do this. It's also coming proactively from the EU. So I think with increased really collaboration and us being able to look at some of these things with a global mindset and some proactivity, there's certainly a lot of positive influence that can come from that, and with a little bit more consultation with the business sector.
Terrific. And as we look ahead into the future over the next months and the next years and even the next decades, what would you say are the next policies that might be copied, if you will, from from Europe into Latin America?
Well, I mentioned one of them already. I think certainly the EU still is very much a trendsetter and setting the tone for a lot of the policy implementation, policy questioning and debates around the world, right? The ones that come to mind, I certainly don't want to predict the future, but I definitely think that the European Green Deal is one. And I told you the anecdote about diplomatic missions proactively wanting to have conversations at the local level with their embassies and governments on the ground, precisely on how do we implement some of these policies in Latin America. Digital future is another one, right? And I'm sure there are many others in terms of circular economy, plastics, waste management. All of these are ones that I think we can be on the lookout for, and a lot of them are actually embedded in this very large European Green Deal.
Thanks again, Anna. I really appreciate your time on this today. Ana Heeren of FTI Consulting joining us today from Washington. I'm Gene Kuleta, editor of the Latin America Advisor at the Inter-American Dialogue in Washington.